So in terms of the provision of charity or the provision of social services or so on, there's private agencies and then there's public agencies. And as with the economy in general, there are kind of two lines of argument you can do to defend that private agencies should properly be doing it. There's sort of the utilitarian argument of, well, you get the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? And then you get the ethical argument that it's the right way to go about it. But as with the economy and charity, as it turns out, the utility of charity, the fact that private charities serve people more effectively and more efficiently is a direct result of the fact that it's grounded in natural law, it's grounded in the ethics, and that produces the utility. They're not separate, they're very, very much integrated. So what is charity? Well, among other things, it's one of the three cardinal virtues, which are faith, hope, and charity. It means love, in the Christian sense, certainly. And as C.S. Lewis expounded in his book, The Four Loves, it's one of the four loves. And it's there were four Greek words that we translate as love, and agape is charity love. We see it if you translate 1 Corinthians 13, which is the very famous verse, using the word charity is a very common way of doing it. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing, and so on. Of course, Jesus told us, or told the story, for I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Truly, I say to you, as you did to one of the least of these my brethren, you did to me. So that's a direct order, so to speak, that we're to be doing all of these things for our fellow men. And then the young ruler who asked Jesus, what are the commandments? And he encapsulated all of the 10 commandments and all of the Jewish law into two. One is to love God with all your heart and with all your mind, importantly, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, a lot of us sort of sit around and ponder, well, what's it mean to love my neighbor as myself? Is that, it's kind of my neighbor. First of all, who's my neighbor? Well, Jesus answered that question with the tale of the Samaritan. The Samaritans were enemies of the Jews, so clearly it's not your next door neighbor that you like, right? It's everybody, whether they're your so-called enemies or whether they're your so-called immediate neighbors and so on. And it doesn't have anything to do with liking them or not. It has to do with doing good for them. And the really interesting thing is when you start doing good for somebody, you end up liking them. And then you like them and you do good for them. So it's a virtuous circle. The more good you do, the more kind you are, the more you love, the more you love, the more kind you are. Well, the converse is very much true too. We call that a vicious circle, right? So Lewis again uses the example of the Germans. Initially they mistreated the Jews because they hated them, and then they hated them because they had mistreated them. So the more cruel you are, the more you hate, and the more you hate, the more cruel you are. So I'm going to talk a little bit again about the private versus public responses to disasters. And it started very early on in the first centuries of the new era after Christ. Rodney Stark, who I think you got his book, Victory of Reason. I don't know if you know very much about Rodney Stark. He's a sociologist. He was an atheist, and he started doing studies of why Christianity grew so quickly. He thought it was really interesting because it grew from very few people to, by the 4th century, thousands of people. I mean, just exponentially. And he wanted to study what kinds of patterns create that kind of growth. And so he wrote this book called The Rise of Christianity, tracing that exponential growth. And one of the reasons he saw that it was adapted very quickly was because of Christians' response to natural disasters of their day, specifically epidemics. So you'd get a huge epidemic. There was one in the middle of the 2nd century and then another one about 100 years later. And nobody knows for sure, but it probably killed about 1/3 of the population. So just very devastating. So pagans, in the face of an epidemic, would tend to just abandon the sick, whether they were in their family or whatever. They'd leave them so they wouldn't get sick. And of course, if you leave somebody who's sick without any care, they're more likely to die. And then once, if somebody had died, they wouldn't take care of the body at all. They just treat it like dirt, which of course then contributes to the conditions that feed the epidemic. The Christians, meanwhile, because they had been taught to be charitable, would stay, they would tend to the sick, and not only to the Christian ill, they tend to the pagan ill as well. So that led to both higher rates of survival among Christians, so the Christians after an epidemic would be a higher percentage of the population, plus the pagans that they'd help, through being helped, now no Christians, they would likely convert, and other pagans who saw that this care was so miraculous would be impressed, and that would tend to make them convert as well. So it was a very powerful force behind Christianity growing so quickly in the first few centuries. And it upset the Roman hierarchy so much that the Emperor Julian in 362 wrote to the high priest of Galatia that pagans needed to start doing charity. Too many people are becoming Christians. He said, quote, "The impious Galileans support not only their poor, but ours as well. Everyone can see that our people lack aid from us." So he wanted to order the pagan priests to start doing charity. Well, of course, they had no reason to, no motivation to, no tradition of it, and they didn't do it. So Christianity continued to take over. Further on, skipping several centuries, in 1832, Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States to study our penal system, our prison system. But he was so struck by American society that he ended up writing Democracy in America. And if you haven't read it, it's a really fascinating read. It's a wonderful documentation of how American society actually operated in the absence of hardly any government. He, of course, was coming from France. And in France and Germany, you didn't have any tradition of not much tradition of private charity. You had a very hierarchical class system. If you're poor, you're poor. If you're lucky, you get some alms or you get to go to the poorhouse. Dickens, of course, writes very stark portrayals of what it was like. And in France, the state took care of all charity. In England, you had more private charity, but not a lot, and it just wasn't considered. If you're born poor because you're supposed to be poor. And if you're born rich because that's your place in society, and that's just the way it is, and you shouldn't try to do anything about it. In America, of course, conversely, people would be much more equal. And they'd work together for the things that they wanted their communities to be. It was a very community-based society. So de Tocqueville wrote about what he called associations. This is a quote, "Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. They have not only commercial and manufacturing companies in which all take part, but associations of 1,000 other kinds, religious, moral, serious, feudal, general or restricted, enormous or diminutive. The Americans make associations to give entertainments, to found seminaries, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries to the antipodes. In this manner they found hospitals, prisons, and schools." So as he observed in American democratic society, power and money were diffused across the population. So there's no one group that's could sort of lord it over the others. So in order to get anything done, they had to work together, right? To get enough money to put together a school or a church or whatever, they had to cooperate and exchange resources. Again, Tocqueville said, "Among democratic nations, all the citizens are independent and feeble. They can do hardly anything by themselves, and none of them can oblige his fellow men to lend him their assistance. They all therefore become powerless if they do not learn voluntarily to help one another. So he called it democracy in America because it fed a feeling of what he called democracy, but we would call equality. Right? So when you work together in things, you come to know your fellow man and you become closer through the doing. And that helps perpetuate that kind of society. And it's a very healthy society. And I really recommend you read that book as a model for how society can be constructed. The Independent Institute also did a book called The Voluntary City, and it's case study examples of how all these things that we think the government has to provide have been and can be done cooperatively and voluntarily, anything you name. Each chapter is on a different topic, and I really recommend if you delve into it and see, well, what about people needing an organ transplant? How would you deal with that? And so on. In England, of course, you had a society where if people were serfs, they were tied to the land and could expect to remain poor all their lives. Then along comes the Industrial Revolution, and it opens up the wonderful liberation for people to be able to leave the land and go into the cities and work for wage labor and better themselves and their families. It was a fantastic, fantastic time, and it's just really weird that the Industrial Revolution is regarded as this horrible time of exploitation when it was exactly the opposite. So these mills were cranking out goods that were being traded all over the world. Simultaneously, England opened up free trade, and that movement moved internationally as well. And then along came the American Civil War. And the American Civil War, unfortunately, resulted in a blockade of cotton that fed the mills in England. So there's a huge depression in England. All these people are thrown out of work, and they're starving. And there was a minister, William Booth, who had left the established church and become a street preacher. And he realized that all these people are dirty, they're hungry, they're in real need, and they're never going to hear the word of God if their stomachs are rumbling. So he started the Salvation Army to feed and clothe and take care of the needy, and thus also save them humanly as well as save their souls. The Salvation Army started in 1865 in London, and it's grown to be in 115 countries. It's been in most countries for well over 100 years. It spread really quickly. India, China before they were kicked out, all over the place. And they serve every need everywhere. It's amazing. They have schools, hospitals, feeding things. They do microfinance programs. They dig wells. They help. They do orphanages. Just an amazing amount of things. But geared to the locale, each locale, it's very highly decentralized. So it's serving the needs specific to any given neighborhood, really. So you have all of these other organizations. The Red Cross also started as a Christian charity. Most, Habitat for Humanity and others. So you have thousands of wonderful private charities all over the world that are doing fantastic jobs. But then at the same time, you have this growing trend of the state wanting to come in, and progressives thinking, well, it's evil for people to be doing this privately. This should be a function of the state. And as Dorothy Sayers talks about, when the state takes over charity, so first of all, who's most likely to support, though lots of organizations like the Salvation Army get lots of money from people that is, $1 in the bucket or $5 or whatever. Obviously, the really big bucks are coming from the people who have more big bucks. So when the state takes it over and they're getting taxes to pay for social service programs, again, the same type of people are going to be paying the big taxes as were previously given to charity, and it shouldn't make any difference, right? But as Dorothy Sayers points out, quote, "The difference is this. People will no longer pay because they want to, eagerly and with love, but because they must, reluctantly, and under pain of fine or imprisonment. She says further, no doubt those who formerly contributed out of love should be very willing to pay a tax instead, but I see very clearly as the hatred of the gracious act and the determination that nobody shall be allowed any kind of spontaneous pleasure in well-doing if envy can prevent it. So it's very much part and parcel of creating a society that's divided, very much the opposite of democracy in America. You create the us versus them. So you have to tax us to take care of them. And there's a gulf between you. So no longer are you working together on something. It's that you are having your money taken away, and it's going to those people over there that you don't know and you don't consequently care about. And the problem is that it's, again, back to the utilitarian problem, is that the public social service programs are not very effective. As our book, The Voluntary City, and I think Greg Remke talked about this too, the mutual aid societies that developed and the private programs that were very effective to help people when they fell out of unemployment or sick or injured, natural disasters and so on. So when the government takes them over, they're not only less efficient, but you end up with people not getting out of their rut, so to speak. And even today, people who have been working in social services for the government for 30 years are starting to see, wait, we helped these people's parents, and now their children are coming to us, and they have to be helped. Whereas under the private charity, Salvation Army and so on, they're offering a hand up, solving fundamental problems. The mutual aid societies, again, would help people with more than just money. It would help them establish a place in the community, make networks and so on, and put them on the first rungs of the economic ladder, and then their children would do better. Under public assistance, it doesn't work that way. You have generation after generation after generation in exactly the same circumstances and not getting anywhere. And even the simplest things can make a huge amount of difference. You don't even think about the fact that owning your home versus being a squatter would make that big of a difference. It's the same house, it's the same place. Harvard did a study of this, in Portuguese we'd call it favela, but sort of a large slum area in Lima. And through a series so people had come in from the country, built these houses, and squatted there. And through sort of an interesting series of circumstances, about half of them were able eventually to get title to the land under their homes, and the others were not. And Harvard went in and did a study, and even though the houses would be literally side by side, the ones who owned their home, their children graduated from school at a higher rate, they had higher incomes, many measurements, they were doing better. And just that security of knowing that you have a stake in the community and in the society versus the uncertainty of being always on the edge and at the mercy of others makes a gigantic difference. I'm going to talk a little bit. I meant to have those passed out, and I know you guys all have more than enough to read, but I have two things that I've written up. One is a case study on Katrina, Hurricane Katrina. I know you were all pretty young at the time. It was a major event to many of us, and this has some really stark examples of the private sector response to it and the public sector's response to it. And then more recently, I wrote a short piece on aftermath of Sandy, so we'll get those passed out. But I'm going to talk about maybe that's the worst case study I've personally been aware of, which was Haiti, the earthquake in Haiti a couple of years ago. A friend of mine who serves on the San Francisco Salvation Army board with me works for UPS, and he also had been doing mission trips to Haiti for many years. He has a friend who has a private medical clinic there, and he'd take his vacation time and go down there for a week every year and help him out. So when the earthquake hit, he was very well prepared to leave. He took personal vacation time from UPS, flew down to Haiti right away and started setting up all of the logistics, coordinating with UPS. So UPS, FedEx, and others immediately loaded cargo planes full of supplies and flew them into Port-au-Prince Airport. My friend was at the airport and started setting up, he's an expert in logistics, starts setting up logistics for distributing it. However, the UN was put in charge of all disaster response in Haiti, and nobody could do anything without going to it. So he told me, he kind of debriefed me on what actually happened on the ground. So the UN organized the needs into what they called clusters. So there was shelter, water, feeding, logistics, and all of the non-governmental private agencies would meet in a tent according to their cluster. And my friend was saying you could be in meetings all day, every day. The UN's holding all these meetings. So Craig's logistics, and in order to do food distribution, he had to have security that accompanied him to, help control the crowds. The UN says they can provide the security. He said, okay, how do I get it? Well, send an email. So he sent an email. 2 days later, he hadn't gotten a response. So he goes to the next meeting, and they, oh yeah, the email system's backed up. Go over to the help desk and tell them what you need. So there are 50 people in line at the help desks. He fills out a piece of paper saying what he needs, which is security, hands it in, no response for 2 days. So finally, the UN asked the Salvation Army to head up their first food distribution attempt. This is 4 days after the earthquake, and they haven't done any real food distribution. The food was being provided by the World Food Program. And the Salvation Army had been in Haiti for 50 years. It had facilities there. So they had set up a site that had controlled access, so, crowd control, so they could have orderly distribution. They were all ready to do it. They were just needing security to do it. So they said, so the UN says, here's some food. Let's use your site. We'll provide security. They sent 20 Argentinian troops to provide the security the first day, and it went really, really well. The next day, the Salvation Army says, "Hey, we have all this food. We want to start distributing it ourselves, and we need the security to do it." So the next day, the UN sends 4 Jamaican troops in a jeep. They go out. They try to do the distribution, but as predicted, this mob forms, and the 4 Jamaicans end up jumping up into the truck, closing it, and driving away. So the next day, the Salvation Army has 3 full tractor-trailer trucks that were sent by this group, Numana, which is based in Kansas, of meals. So it's like 260,000 meals to be distributed. Meanwhile, Geraldo Rivera had shown up with a camera crew from Fox. He wants to go along on the distribution and film and do a story. So they all sit around, and no troops come from the UN, so they can't go out at all. So meanwhile, all of this stuff is staged at the airport in Port-au-Prince, and the US had sent the 82nd Airborne to help out, and they've been sitting at the airport for a week because they haven't gotten permission from the UN to leave the airport yet. So my friend finally goes over to the colonel who's with the 82nd Airborne, and he says, "Look, we've got all this food. People are out there starving. Can you just go out with us and we can distribute the food?" And the guy says, "I'd really love to, but I have to get permission from the UN to do it." And he says, "Okay, fine. So finally, the next day, the colonel just comes over to my friend and he says, "To hell with it, let's just do it." So they load up the trucks. The 82nd Airborne goes out with them. They distribute 260,000 meals that day with perfect order. And after that, this colonel who heads up the 82nd Airborne says, "Anything you want to do, any place you want to go, we're with you, we'll do it." So there's a community in Haiti called Cité Soleil, the City of the Sun. And if you look it up in Wikipedia or Google or whatever, it's the most violent city in the world. Okay. So 8 days after the earthquake, no supplies have been sent to Cité Soleil. And obviously the people are probably not getting less violent under starving conditions. So the UN comes to the Salvation Army and they says, hey, you want to go out to Cité Soleil and give them some food? They're probably getting a little hungry. So they say, sure, we'll go out. They go out and do a distribution, perfect order, perfect order. This is people who hadn't had anything for 8 days. And so this goes on, and they ended up setting up, he set up really sophisticated systems. They had a tent city with 20,000 people living in it. He gave each tent home a barcode identifier, and they would, when people came to get their supplies every day, they'd scan it in. So they had a record of who had gotten it, who hadn't gotten it, and they could keep very orderly track that everybody was getting what they needed all the time. Haiti is a failed state. I don't know if people have talked to you about vampire states this week, but it's a vampire state. And 2 years later, what is it? 3 years later now? These millions of dollars have gone there, and it hasn't helped. But at least during the time of very horrific need, these organizations were able to serve the immediate need. The long-term need is going to need institutional change. But just as contrast, when the UN did their own distribution, they'd go out and just dump a 50-pound bag of rice off of a truck and let the people act like animals, grabbing at it. So it's the difference in how you regard people. You're both giving them rice, but one is doing it with love and dignity, and one is doing it with, here you go, you animals, go act like animals. Arthur Brooks, who's now the president of American Enterprise Institute, has done some really good work in this area. He did a book called Who Really Cares? And he studied patterns of giving. And it's not surprising that so-called progressives who believe that the state should take care of people don't give to charity, because the government's supposed to be doing that. So their levels of charitable giving is extremely low. Meanwhile, people who go to church and really believe what they're hearing in church tend to give very high proportions of their income. Even if their household income is not high, they give proportionally very high levels to charity. And Arthur has also done work on, it was interesting because John Stossel did a special, one of his shows based on that book back when he was at NBC. And he used the Salvation Army as a case study example. So he went with a bell ringer to Union Square in San Francisco, kind of the bastion of liberal progressivism, and stood with them and watched all the people walking by and not putting money into the kettle, right? And then they went with another bell ringer to kind of the Bible Belt country in front of a Walmart and stood with the bell ringer, and everybody walking by is putting money in the kettle. So it was a really great, stark case study of the truth of Arthur Brooks's thesis. So Arthur talks about why there's a huge trend also to government funding of private charity. The Salvation Army, much to my chagrin, gets a lot of money from government. Government gives them money to run their Meals on Wheels programs, a lot of their social service programs, and so on. And I saw very up close and personal the problem with that is in San Francisco in the late 1990s, we were getting about $3 million a year from the government. We were running a homeless shelter. We were the contractor who did the Meals on Wheels programs. We had a detox program for people to get clean and sober and off of drugs, including we had the only facility in San Francisco which could pass health inspection for people with HIV and AIDS to go through detox. And all of those were being funded by the government. In the late 1990s, the City Council of San Francisco passed this domestic partners ordinance requiring anybody who had a contract with the government to give equal benefits to domestic partners as they gave to spouses of employees. And not only in San Francisco, but in their worldwide operations. So here's the City Council of San Francisco telling the Salvation Army, which is headquartered in London, that they have to have a new corporate policy that every employee's domestic partner gets benefits equal to spouses. Well, the Salvation Army is not going to do that. And so we tried to be very nice and say, we're sorry we can't comply with the ordinance, so, come the end of the contract, we won't be able to renew it. Well, it got into the media as the Salvation Army is homophobic and da-da-da-da, and it was a huge mess. But the upshot was, overnight from September 30th to October 1st, when the new year starts for the Salvation Army, they lost $3 million. So we shut down Meals That Heal, we shut down the homeless shelter, we shut down the detox, including letting all these people with HIV/AIDS have no place else to go. And about half the board quit. A lot of people were on the board for social reasons and stuff. And so they asked me, you want to be chairman? And I it was kind of a bloody mess, but I said, yeah, because I thought this was a great opportunity to show that they don't need government money. And if we could make a case study, then maybe other people would wake up to it too. So we had a renaissance. We discovered that because we'd been getting all this government money, we hadn't been going out to the community and telling them about what we're doing and asking them to contribute. So there was plenty of money we hadn't been asking for. The board had gotten really stale. People kind of came and had lunch because there wasn't important work for them to do. There was all this easy money coming in. A lot of the programs we were doing weren't really, I call it the Pentagon model of funding, charity. The government, we were doing these programs because that's what the government was funding, but they weren't necessarily the programs we should be doing, or they might not necessarily serve the people the way they should be. So Meals on Wheels, okay. Meals on Wheels is a federal program, and it delivers a hot meal a day, well, during the week, to homebound seniors. So you have to be over 60 years old and other things. Well, we went out and got a private grant from the evil tobacco company, Philip Morris, I think it was, and we created a new program called Meals That Heal. And we would serve any age people. So, we had, and including, there were people who were homebound because they're dying of HIV/AIDS. So this homophobic organization is out there doing more than the government had been willing to do. So it was really a fabulous thing. Today, the San Francisco Salvation Army is far stronger than it was then. It gets far more money, and our programs are much, much better. And Arthur Brooks also documents this in his work, and he points out that public money is far more volatile than private money. It goes up really high, and then it can go down really low, and it really endangers any organization that's dependent on it. And especially if you become politically incorrect, like the Salvation Army, whoops, there you go. And so it's really doing a disservice to your clients if you're a charity to accept government money because it's endangering them. It's fiduciarily irresponsible, and I keep telling people this and they won't listen to me. Again, there's not a market test of your programs. The government's giving you money, so you're not going out and saying, is this the best thing we could be doing? And donors aren't, keeping you honest. And if you have to go out and raise money from people, you have to tell them, these are the results we're achieving. They may suggest, well, is that really the best thing you can be doing? Or how about this unmet need? So again, having that feedback mechanism that the market gives you makes you better and better every day in every way. And again, it reinforces that us versus them mentality. You're not working directly with people. You're getting this, and your donors aren't coming in and volunteering and learning that these homeless people are really not different than you are. I mean, when I work with the people, the clients of the Salvation Army and work to help them, and I really, that dictum of there but for the grace of God go I is so true. These people are not any different than we are. I had a bit of bad luck or something, but it's, they're people just like you are, and it again reinforces that equality, that democracy, and that love. It's a virtuous circle. And I think that's about all I'm going to say, and now we're going to talk together. So, yes, I'm sorry, what's your name?
I'm Joshua.
Hi, Joshua.
What will you do in the future, in the next disaster? How do you think you'll be able to conduct it better without the help of the government?
I'm glad you raised that because it brought up another point I kind of wanted to talk about. He's asking, what would you do in the next disaster? Can you do it better without the government than with them? The Katrina case study and the Haiti case study that I mentioned shows that very clearly that government agencies interfere. Katrina was really stark because the government actually set up barricades around the city of New Orleans. The Red Cross and the Salvation Army came there with trucks, trailer trucks full of supplies, water, food, etc. And they were literally kept from going into New Orleans to serve people because the government said that will keep people from leaving. And they wanted people to evacuate. But on the other hand, they wouldn't let people leave if they were on foot because the surrounding cities were very concerned about looting. So you could only leave the city if you had transport. Well, there wasn't any transport. People are trapped in the Superdome, which was just hellish circumstances. The story of the Superdome has never come out, and it was really horrible. So there 2 years later, I'm on the National Salvation Army Board. 2 years later, we meet in a different city each time we meet. So we met in New Orleans 2 years later to kind of talk to the people who had served and see how things were going 2 years after Katrina. The lieutenant governor came to our dinner to talk to us one night. Why anybody invited him, I don't know. But it was hysterical because he's talking about Katrina and how when he was walking around New Orleans in the days following Katrina, when things were still really bad, he'd come across somebody who's giving out food, and he'd ask him, "Oh, where are you from?" "Well, I'm from so-and-so, and I have a restaurant, and I loaded everything up, and I came and I snuck into the city to distribute food." And I mean, he told about 5 of these stories, and each of them are telling him they snuck in, and he's not hearing what he's saying. These are people that he's lauding for helping, but they had to break the law to do so. So, and again, then there was Hurricane, was it Ike, a couple of years later? Or maybe the next year? Anyway, another hurricane. So it happened in the middle of the Republican National Convention. So Cindy McCain and Laura Bush come out on the stage, and they say, "We really urge you to give to the charities whose names are on the screen behind us." And rolling up on the screen behind them are these names of charities, and they're all government agencies that are being used to channel money into state agencies. Some of it's going to private charity, but the question is how much is being eaten up. And so that's literally stealing the money that would have gone directly to the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army has a policy of 100% of contributions go to aid. They don't keep anything for overhead. They work on raising money to cover the overhead otherwise. You can't say that for the government. So it's really insidious. President Obama and his progressive pals, I think, really, really want to end private charity. He's had 7, it might be 8 now, 7 proposals in the course of his years in office to end or limit the charitable deduction. He actively undermines charity. This business with Sandy, there's a lot of propaganda going on right now about private charity not being transparent in their use of their funds. Well, I want to see the transparency from what the government did with their money, you know. The government's the most intransparent agency there is, and there's no accountability whatsoever. And the people who work in disasters from the government are mean. The people who work with the Red Cross and the Salvation Army and the Mennonites and other organizations are kind and loving and helpful. It's really sort of, they bark at people. You know, it's like the UN throwing a sack of rice on the ground. They don't, it's like, well, that ought to be good enough for you, right? Yes, Morgan.
I've heard people criticize private charity as, being, inferior toward, like government mandated welfare or whatever, on the grounds that it has this kind of demeaning quality, the kind of patron generously bestowing largesse, and that actually it works against that kind of social equality and democracy which Tocqueville praised.
Right.
When it's, the sort of thing you should be grateful for rather than something you're entitled to as a citizen or whatever.
Right. Okay, so Morgan asked, essentially, the criticism of private charity as being sort of the Lady Bountiful bestowing gift baskets on the poor and isn't she great, versus the government, which is this great leveler, and they're providing human needs as they should, and it provides people with the dignity that they're not receiving charity. Does that accurately? Okay. Well, as we see in practice, that's not the way it works. Again, Tocqueville shows that when we're helping one another, we're building one another up, and I've certainly seen it in my personal interactions. And the mutual aid societies, again, it was peer-to-peer. It's essentially getting your own contribution back or your help from your community, and then when you're built up, you're going to help that community in turn. So it's the virtuous circle. When government is helping people, and this entitlement mentality that we get, again, there's no expectation that you will, as a result of somebody caring about you, that you will now do better in the future. It's just like, oh, you're dependent, here's your money for today. It's very insidious, and that's the vicious circle, and we see it in practice of where generation after generation after generation stays here. Is that compassionate? Do we want people to live in dependence? It saps your soul to be dependent. You're all reaching your age of independence, or have already, or I'm sure you're all very independent people now. And it's as human beings, that's part and parcel of our DNA. We want to be people of achievement. We want to be people who can stand on our own feet. We want the feeling of that empowerment. And when we're in a position of dependency, it grates on us and it saps our soul. It really does. Yes, sir.
In your experience, to what extent does the government try to discourage private charities through making the process of becoming a nonprofit more difficult than it needs to be?
So he's asking about, the IRS process for becoming a nonprofit, if that's actively discouraging people. In my personal experience, it hasn't been the case. It's pretty easy to become a nonprofit. There is all this thing about, under the Obama administration, they politicizing it and getting in the way of people becoming nonprofits. And I believe the accounts, and it's come out, and these people, the people they're trying to lay the blame on are admitting, yes, it happened, but hey, it wasn't our idea. We were told to do it. So clearly they did it. And it's just nuts that they want to put our health care under this agency and politicize it as well. And what can you expect when you've got a government agency in charge of something? It's going to get politicized. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name.
Nick.
Nick.
Do you think there will always be a steady enough stream of money coming from the public to private charities, or do you think there needs to be some sort of baseline amount from the government, or do you think there always will be enough from the public?
Okay, so he's asking if I think there's sufficient money available from the private sector.
Constant enough.
Yeah, sufficient and constant. Or if, the government needs to help cover that. The government's only getting money from the private sector anyway. So there's plenty of money in the private sector, and even when there's an economic downturn, responsible charities have saved up a cushion to tide us over in the bad times. And we can also make economies. The Independent Institute, in the aftermath of the 2008 thing, foundations stopped giving completely almost, and a lot of individuals cut back. So it was a real hit. But we adapted like your homes adapted, where we cut back on some things. We got a little bit more creative about where to find money, and we dug into our savings. So I think there's plenty of private money, and especially if you have the government stop taking it from people and diverting it into things that they want to fund instead of things that you want to fund. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Anthony, Gregory, yes?
While getting nonprofit status might be that difficult, might you want to just talk for a minute or so about other regulations and how they might interfere with private charity? We watched a piece of the Stossel clip about just this woman who was giving out hot meals, but because the local government came down because she didn't have the right kind of sink and so forth, and treating her like a restaurant. Not that restaurants should be treated that way.
Right. That's going to be my problem with this. Is it's a problem for everybody. Okay, so Anthony was asking about the regulations that impede charitable works, such as a soup kitchen having to comply with health department regulations and so on. I personally, I think it's the same as in the for-profit sector. You know, it's a problem for all of us. It makes everything more expensive for everybody, including we can do less for people, and we can do less for fewer people because of them. It's everything from taking care of children at our homeless shelter, which has to be inspected and licensed in the capacity. And if somebody doesn't show up for work one day, you have to send children home because you don't have sufficient number of parents and so on. To everything else, but I don't differentiate it from the for-profit sector.
Right.
And I frankly, when I was in business, I probably spent at least half of my time dealing with government regulations and regulators and clerks who would show up waving a badge and want to do an inspection. It's the biggest sap on this economy. I do really think that there's a movement afoot to smear private charity. I really do think that there's an explicit agenda to replace private charity with government programs as they got rid of things like mutual aid societies, as they're getting rid of private health insurance and so on. I think there really is a desire to make everything under the state. So I really encourage you all to be informed on this issue, and when people start attacking it, be ready to defend charity over government programs. As you're going to get, once the government takes it over, it's going to be bad news. If I have to, we live in earthquake country. I used to live in tornado country, and reading accounts of people who are homeless and so on. There's a really good book this man wrote called Breakfast at Sally's. So he really, he went from having a mansion and yachts and cars and a family to being homeless on the street with his dog and about to commit suicide, but he realized he couldn't leave his dog without an owner, so he didn't. And it's a long account of several years on the streets, and he never once mentions the government program. It's all these churches and the Salvation Army. Sally's is the Salvation Army, so you'd have breakfast at the Salvation Army every morning. And after disasters, my brother's house was destroyed by a tornado. And immediately the Mennonites and the Salvation Army, they're helping. The government may show up several days later. They may not. They probably won't have what you need. And if I ever face a natural disaster here and it's after the government's taken over charity, I'm going to make sure I have everything I need myself and hope that I can help my neighbors as well. So, on that cheery note, thank you.